Welcome to Alameda County's Disaster Service Worker Volunteer Program Management Training. Disaster service workers are special volunteers who go above and beyond the call of duty to provide services during emergencies. All county and city employees not already serving as first responders in police, fire, or emergency medical services can be called up as disaster service workers. Typically, these employees trade out regular work hours for emergency service hours, and as such, are not really volunteers, but continuing city and county employees already covered by existing workers' compensation. Regular citizens, on the other hand, are not covered unless they are true volunteers working without pay and are registered in the State Disaster Service Worker Volunteer Program. Alameda County's Community Emergency Response Team, or CERT program, is an excellent example of a successful volunteer organization. The CERT program is designed to support new volunteers and existing community groups such as Neighborhood Watch, Rotary Clubs, American Legion, or faith-based communities to provide them with the training and certification they need to participate in disaster service. Incorporated cities may have their own CERT teams, or in the case of Oakland, CORE teams. Others may be run through the fire department and contracted through Alameda County or the Sheriff's Department or other agency. This film will address guidelines required by the state of California when working with disaster service volunteers. It's particularly important that you follow the requirements, not only to comply, but also to ensure that your volunteers qualify for insurance coverage and your community qualifies for financial reimbursement following an emergency. We'll discuss city accreditation, registering, swearing in, and filing workers' compensation claims when needed. If you need to know more about the Alameda CERT program or other issues relating to recruiting or becoming a volunteer, see the video in this series on volunteering. Prior to World War II, volunteers putting their lives on the line for their state and country had not been eligible to receive compensation for injuries. The California Workers' Compensation Act was created to cover volunteers with insurance in case of injury. California state law now protects volunteers from financial loss resulting from injury, as well as providing limited immunity from liability in the course of disaster service duties. Today, the California Emergency Council's job is to advise the governor and the California Emergency Management Agency, CalEMA, by approving preparations for disasters and other emergencies. One of their most important statutory duties is to approve local disaster councils for accreditation by the governor and CalEMA. Your authority to use volunteers in emergencies comes from them, and of course the state laws behind them. California counties do not need accreditation because they are already part of the state government, but cities, either incorporated or unincorporated, must apply for accreditation if they want the power to swear in volunteers. Most cities in California already have accredited disaster councils. If your city isn't accredited, the process is fairly simple. And once accredited, your disaster council can register volunteers, receive state support, and workers' compensation coverage. Accreditation can occur directly from the California Emergency Council by application, during a CEC meeting, or through ratification of the governor's approval in cases when the CEC is not meeting. To become eligible, a disaster council should provide the CEC with a certified copy of an ordinance addressing 4 items. The ordinance must provide for the existence of a city disaster council. A chairperson or director of the disaster council must be specified. The emergency management organization must be recognized, and compliance with the Emergency Services Act must be stated. You can get a template for the ordinance from the CEC website or CalEMA. Remember, accreditation or certification of a disaster council is mandatory in order to register disaster service worker volunteers. If you are unsure of your city's accreditation status, contact your city manager or CalEMA. The state defines a disaster service worker volunteer as any person registered with an accredited disaster council for the purpose of engaging in disaster service without pay or other compensation. There are several types of DSW volunteers: registered, convergent, and those impressed into service. Registered DSW volunteers are those recruited and registered with an accredited disaster council, CalEMA, or another authorized state agency prior to service. According to the state of California, disaster service means all activities authorized by and carried on pursuant to the California Emergency Services Act, including approved and documented training necessary or proper to engage in such activities. It does not include the day-to-day activities of law enforcement, fire, or emergency medical services. We'll address registration in more detail in a moment, but first, let's look at unregistered volunteers. Some volunteers will come forward spontaneously during a time of crisis. They converge on the scene of the emergency to lend assistance. These are convergent volunteers. They can be extremely important in augmenting emergency operations. As many as 10,000 convergent volunteers came forward during the Loma Prieta earthquake here in 1989. By their very nature, convergent volunteers are not pre-registered. So in order to meet state requirements and provide them with protection, you must register them. Your local emergency planning should include provisions for organizing and registering convergent volunteers. Of course, not all emergencies benefit from convergent volunteers. Sometimes you already have enough staff, and sometimes more training is required than you have time for. In these cases, convergent volunteers should either be registered or thanked and sent to safety. Once a convergent volunteer is registered, they're no longer considered convergent. Sometimes a disaster service worker doesn't need to volunteer. The state defines any unregistered person as impressed into service when they're recruited in a state of war or emergency, or on the spot in the midst of crisis by a person having authority to command the aid of the citizens in the execution of his or her duties. For example, an emergency official, such as a firefighter, police officer, or other public official, can order a bystander to assist in an immediate emergency situation. I'm impressing you into service. Wave off the traffic so it doesn't hit me while I help this child. Under such rare circumstances, an unregistered volunteer is immediately covered by workers' compensation and has immunity from liability, the same as a registered volunteer. Should this occur, emergency officials should make note of the volunteer's name, address, and phone number. Except for this rare exception of being impressed into service, all volunteers need to be registered and sworn in before performing work. Official registration can be quick and easy. Fill out a registration form and take the loyalty oath from an authorized officer. Blank registration form templates are available from the Alameda County Public Health Department and from CalEMA. It's important to register all volunteers prior to their service work because state law makes retroactive registration illegal. Even if a person has been working as a volunteer with the intent to register, they will not be covered in case of injury until they register and take the oath. Once a registration form is filled out, it must be signed by both the volunteer and the city authority administering the oath. If the volunteer is under 18, the signature of a parent or legal guardian is required. The last and most important part of the registration process is the loyalty oath. According to state law, no workers' compensation benefit or reimbursement of expenses may be paid to any DSW worker unless the loyalty oath has been taken or subscribed to. So it doesn't hurt for individuals to take the oath more than once, to have multiple certified registrations in their record. The oath comes directly out of the California Constitution and is printed at the bottom of the registration page. It's to be administered only by an officer authorized for such purposes. At the state level, all executive and judicial officers and all legislators are automatically authorized to administer the oath. Court clerks, retired judges, justices, and even notary publics have oath administering authority. If you're not one of these, then you need to be authorized by the CEC and CalEMA. At the county and city level, each emergency event or jurisdiction should have a redundancy of at least 3 people pre-authorized to administer the loyalty oath. Simply have the clerk of the county or city submit the names of all intended authorizing officers in writing to CalEMA as delegates for administering the loyalty oath. As always, if you have any questions, contact the California Emergency Council or CalEMA. Alameda's CERT program automatically provides registration and administers the oath as part of its comprehensive disaster service training. To become a CERT member, volunteers must attend the CERT training course and then meet the program participation requirements. Active membership in a program like CERT makes it easy to verify your volunteer status. Many programs even have official ID cards. A DSW volunteer can be registered for a single event, multiple events as an active DSW volunteer response team member with registration effective for the duration of team membership, or by a local disaster council exercising its discretion to establish registration for a certain number of years. A background check or health exam are not required for DSW volunteers. However, professional licenses or certificates should be verified when pertinent. For more information, contact California Volunteers. Once they're registered, disaster service workers will be given some preparatory training. The best training comes from comprehensive pre-event training and regularly scheduled exercises. Since volunteers are important assets in any major response, they should be involved early in your preparedness efforts. During the training process, volunteers are insured while participating in pre-approved and documented programs. Disaster service workers should wait for activation from their supervising authority before carrying out any volunteer work to ensure protection during their time of service. When you deploy workers in an emergency, they should all be given job action sheets or scope of work detailing their position and responsibilities. These documents can help both managers and volunteers. They not only serve as handy references during an event, but can be submitted as the formal job descriptions for workers' compensation coverage in case of injury. Disaster service worker volunteers are covered by California State Workers' Compensation Insurance while performing disaster services or authorized disaster training exercises. In a real event, travel is covered, but note that travel is not covered to and from training. Only your own insurance coverage will apply. DSW volunteers will not be covered for participation in parades, public exhibitions, physical fitness training, or other activities not related to disaster service. However, there are exceptions. For instance, if a public parade is used for crowd control training, then it's covered. If an injury occurs to any of your volunteers, you should take care of their medical needs immediately. Call 911 if the injury is life-threatening. If 911 is not available because of a disaster, contact the nearest emergency medical team. One of the benefits of being a disaster service worker is that, as part of the response effort, you'll be in the closest possible contact with medical help. In case of emergency care, the supervising agency can select the most appropriate medical provider. Although, prior to injury, a DSW volunteer can designate a provider or facility, and that treatment must be allowed. In a non-emergency situation, the DSW volunteer can be referred to his or her own medical provider. Once the medical emergency is taken care of, make sure to report all injuries to your incident command. Unit leaders should note the time and details of the injury in the unit log. Collect copies of the injured volunteer's registration and job action sheet. Then you need a copy of Form 3301 from the State Compensation Insurance Fund. This form is the employee's claim for workers' compensation benefits. It can be provided by the supervising agency or downloaded from the State Compensation Insurance Fund website. This form must be provided to the insured worker or volunteer within 24 hours of the supervisor's knowledge of the injury. The injured worker or volunteer must fill out and sign Form 3301. The completed form must then be returned to the Alameda County Emergency Preparedness Office within 3 days. That's 72 hours of requesting it. Alameda County will then file the claim with the California State Compensation Insurance Fund, with copies going to CalEMA. The California State Compensation Insurance Fund, or SCIF for short, is obligated to make a final decision to accept or deny a claim within 90 days of the supervising agency's knowledge of an alleged claim. This process may involve medical evaluations and investigative interviews to properly assess the claim. The claimant and supervising agency will both be notified when a determination is made. It isn't the exciting part of disaster service work, but the protection of registration and oath records is one of the most important, especially if injuries occur. Months after an incident, these records can still save lives. Disaster service file retention should follow the same rules as other public agency records. Filing should occur within 30 days. State agencies should file with the State Department of Personnel Administration. Counties should file with the Office of the County Clerk, and cities with their own city clerk. Your local disaster council should make sure all documentation is properly filed for the protection of all its DSW volunteers. So, to review, first, disaster service worker volunteers must be registered and take the loyalty oath in order to be covered by workers' compensation. And proper file retention procedures should be followed. This process can only be done by an accredited disaster council registered with the California Emergency Council and CalEMA. Once a disaster service worker volunteer is registered, their benefits are activated and they're covered during their time of service, including approved training. In the event of injury, volunteers are insured by the State Compensation Insurance Fund. An injured volunteer should receive Form 3301 within 24 hours of injury. They should fill it out and return it quickly so that it can be filed with the state within the next 72 hours. The agency should submit a copy of the job action sheet, a copy of the registration form, and the original signed 3301 to the State Compensation Insurance Fund with copies of all documents going to CalEMA. The DSW Volunteer Program values the men and women who serve without pay. Their contributions during times of crisis are crucial. Alameda County thanks you for your service and hopes that you follow these guidelines to protect disaster service workers. Even more, We hope that safe operations make these precautions less necessary in the future.